Hi, everyone. I'm back with another conversation about makers and doers. I'm stoked because you need to meet Abby Gates. I met Abby in Grand Rapids, lovingly GR, as I like to call it, at the Midwest House Summit. And Abby is doing amazing things. She is the founder and CEO of SproutWise. We're going to talk all about what SproutWise is. Hi, Abby. Welcome.
Hey, thanks. When you stood up to ask your question at that session, it was like in response to me saying, I think it was talking about redeploying talent in the state. And it was, I think the particular line was something around like taking teachers and they would be, those exiting that profession would be incredible chiefs of staff. And yet we've got people leaving that profession in droves and then, sort of stumbling to figure out their next steps. And something about that hit a chord. And then you stood up and asked a great question, also did some advocacy, which is so important to me on a human level. And then we got to have this really cool hour-long conversation after the fact about lots of different things, your background, the work you've done, things that are important to you. And who knew that some freezing cold couple of days in Grand Rapids would have meant a connection where there's so much shared value. I'm actually shocked we've never met before, but
You know,
honored to be here.
well, this is part of like my journey as I'm like learning. And also for y'all, like we're not star-crossed lovers, but we did the flip. Abby is from the Chicagoland area in the D, and then I spent 20 years in Chicagoland, and then so it's kind of funny how we have a sort of flippy flop. So we have a shortened interview time today, so I want to get right into it with Abby because Abby, you are this treasure trove of information and knowledge on many levels. And one of my favorite things to do is actually be a publicist for people that I meet. So let me be your publicist for a second here.
Thank you.
So you've had a few exits already, so you understand the ethos and you understand the rigor of a startup space. You understand what that means and that vibe. And obviously now you're a founder and counseling, whether it's startups, but also mid-sized companies on what it means for talent and people. And I want to get right into the nitty gritty because we are, filming this in mid-December-ish. And I believe the jobs report is coming out or is out. Unemployment rates are being updated. And it's a real issue in terms of talent, and sometimes the word and phrase HR is a bad word for many. I would love your perspective on the vocation, your work, and what it's like for you to counsel these teams in such an important component of what makes companies function.
Yeah, I think about I often joke when I'd started working in HR, I wish it were born out of some strategy. Like I wish I could say to you that the entirety of my college education was geared toward working in this space, standing up people programs, human psychology, labor relations, any of these degree programs. But I like to say I've come by it honestly thereafter. And I've done a lot of soul searching over the last handful of years, call it, my age or just reflection, or maybe it's just me, but it has been a journey in my career. And, I've fallen into these really incredible opportunities to have such depth around the building process, such visibility for how those things are done, seeing the ambition and the interest of natural problem solvers to be a part of a solution, people testing themselves to do things that have either never been done before or they've personally never done. But there's this energy and so much trust across these particular teams to do just that, which is we're aiming to solve a problem that hadn't been done in this way before. So it's been a really magical experience to see that happen. And I think when I think about my own trajectory, I started off in recruiting. So much of the work that I've done for a long time was how can I allow for people to experience that magic and bring those skills to those organizations? And how can we ensure that like we've put together a role, a job that helps to get the most out of the skills they bring to bear? And I think at some point and I've said this a number of times, it's a sales process. Recruiting it at its core is gearing toward an outcome, and that outcome is someone joining an organization. But I think the real magic for me came into when I started thinking about how do we ensure that we as organizations are fulfilling that promise? So when we think about, and this was, and when it was a really employee centric market, like we were seeing incredible investment in benefits to attract teams, especially in high tech startups. Like salary growth and the ability to offer these really high caliber jobs to this talent it wasn't something I'd seen in my career. So it was just this really fascinating opportunity to push those bounds and see how we might do those things. And I do think we've seen a reckoning over the past, even handful of years around like this pulling in the reins. So when I think back on those exits and I think back at the investment of those teams and the investment of those leadership teams and what it took to get there, I think the work now that I'm trying to do is bring a lot of that expertise earlier in that journey so that it doesn't feel like it's met that these leaders are met with so many hurdles and so many hiccups, because investing in their people structure, people infrastructure and strategy feels out of reach at that stage. But it doesn't have to be. Like, the people in an organization are important. They are the reason that these ideas come to life. And I do think that there is this opportunity to meet the moment economically, where we're at as a country. It's been an interesting year to meet where industry is, where opportunity with things like AI might be, and have some really open, honest conversations around how does everyone stand to win in this dynamic? How can we create benefit for all parts of this dynamic? And so it's fascinating, difficult, challenging. It's impossible to solve, but it's been this really interesting, large scale idea in my head all year.
So for folks who might be starting something, and for those watching, it doesn't need to be Michigan because Abby is nationwide, and SproutWise is nationwide. At what phase of a founder's journey? Let's say it's in the category of someone starting a company and they have a core team and they started a concept and it's becoming a business. At
Mhm.
what stage would they bring in a team like Sproutwise to advise them? Because I think about some of those founder stages, thinking back to when Michael and I started what we started, it was just frenetic and like trying to keep all the tape together. When would someone bring in Sproutwise, and how would you work with a founder in that initial journey as they have the frenetic, crazy town of investors and KPIs and all the stuff that is so sassy in terms of acronyms?
Yeah. And I think the Abby, 3, 5 years ago would have answered this question very differently. I'd
Mhm.
never been in the seat of someone building a business. And it has been humbling. It has brought so much perspective. It's forced me to accelerate learning in places and areas that I would have never thought of. They would have never been on my radar. So, and I'll use an example from my business to inform how I answer this. But my brain does not intuitively think of revenue forecasting and modeling and profit margins and forecasting, and it's just not a natural place I tend to go. I'm a highly relational person who loves working with the people around me and driving collaboration and programs to help cultivate and accelerate those things. But maybe out of sheer stubbornness early in the journey, it was, well, I'm a business owner now and I have to figure that out. Like, it is on me to solve for. And so, but I think at some point you realize, and this is what I would implore any founder or CEO to think about, when you look at the things that take up your day that run counter to the capability you naturally have, like the time and investment it would take you to solve for that is so much greater than the cost to outsource that, because someone is better positioned, has the bandwidth, or is just frankly more capable for solving for that. That is the point where, and if it's people, if it's legal, if it's marketing, sales, it doesn't matter what it is. But
Mhm.
if you find those things eat up so much of your bandwidth and also are not intuitive to your skill set, this is where I, now think you have to be honest with yourself about what you bring to the table and what you don't. And that is the beginning of building a high performing team around you. It is the basis of that trust of building a team where everyone has a superpower. And that, I would never in a million years think that you and I would be intellectual equals in the world you live in. You're here in this conversation if we were talking about marketing and or strategy because you're better than I am. And for good reason. Like, you've got the chops, you've got those things to back it up. And so it is that honesty around, if this is one of those things that causes tension, if it causes stress and takes up so much time, then I would argue that, that opportunity is fairly immediately. But it just depends. There are things that guide this decision. Budgeting, that is a massive consideration. How big is the team today? Does this feel under control? Are there some early signals that lead to things like burnout, some red flags, feedback that hasn't been surfaced, or misalignment? So there are lots of things that inform how I might answer that question. But the biggest and the first is, do you have the capability and the bandwidth to solve for it at all? And if you don't, earlier is better.
Got it. So it's almost it's the equivalent the way that I visualize it, like a strategic pinch hitter. Because I think about and let's talk about some also brass tack examples. So in the founder stage when people are starting out or even like, companies that are already humming, what types of no-brainer tasks or project strategy, whatever way you want to define it, have you found is a no-brainer for SproutWise to come in and your team to be like, got you. Boom, 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 boom. We'll handle this. To your point, you do the marketing, get it, do the paid. What do you think is low hanging fruit that even some folks aren't even considering or thinking about in terms of the efficiencies and time savers that you find is so much more beneficial to let their business roll?
Yeah. There's a couple of examples. And one, I'll start with the unsexiest part of this puzzle, which is like, we don't even love this stuff, but we have to care about it. There's legalities and compliance that have to be considered. They just do. I mean, labor laws and the complexity there across even the United States, state level guidelines, federal guidelines, even in some cases, local regulation. Like those things have to be considered when thinking about building a team because they matter. And it would come into play like some easy examples. And I'll use tech startups because that's, tends to be, the kind of company that I grew up in and spent a lot of time in. But if those companies are, for instance, remotely based and they've got talent across the US, there are states that have much more permissive policies and regulation than others. And it might be as simple as you've got someone based in the state of California, which tends to be a very employee friendly state. You might have someone based in, I don't know, Missouri, which may not tend to be an employee friendly state. But it's even questions around, do we use California's employee friendly regulation as our prevailing philosophy around how we might govern our team? And it's not only from a compliance standpoint, but the downstream effects would be you're now starting to think about your talent brand and you're thinking about, if we are attracting people to come to our company from other organizations, are
Mhm.
we competitive in terms of what other organizations might be offering? It is this value proposition to people. Compliance tends to be this gateway drug to other things in that way. And again, we have to care about it. And I would say the second is, and only because there's such a clear line to value when we're engaging with founders, but there is some regulation, so there's a compliance element to this. But I would argue compensation, because again, it starts to tie back to so many different philosophical elements of bringing or building infrastructure within teams. One, it's transparency around wages at all, and ensuring there's not any sort of discrimination or that it is well founded and rooted in data so that it's at least informed. And then the other part of this becomes, how do you want to position yourself again in terms of your value proposition for the team you'll build? Again, because, as the competitive landscape might become more saturated, as expansion now is on the table, as there might be some other, let's call it like economic head or tailwinds that either force the issue of thinking through compensation practices or accelerate such growth, you have to solve for it now because now you've got planning and long term strategy on the table. It tends to be something we can establish some easy value with early, then leads into other things that might be more nebulous from a people standpoint, if that makes sense. So, those two things.
It does, and it brought me back to a time. I'm not going to disclose the where I was at the time, but I had a pretty interesting conversation with an organization I was with. It was a remote situation, and it was the first time where the state thing came up, and I quickly learned that organizations tend to not hire from certain states because of what you just mentioned, where and I didn't even know that that was possible. So then I did some further digging and I found that I'd love to know your opinion. I think this is, but I think I'm not, is it legal? Where folks would, mention there's a job opening, it's a remote position, and then they would list the states that folks were eligible to live in, to work in. And I had spoken with someone some time ago, specifically actually about California,
Mhm.
because how employee friendly it was and how certain folks just didn't want to hire from that particular state because of things they would have to do to be very employee centric. So my mind was like, oh my goodness, I didn't even think about that. I don't think folks realize that not all states are equal when it comes to remote environment. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say it's accurate. And, think about again, like my use case tends to be these early stage organizations.
Hmm.
These are not well staffed, like built out enterprise teams that have boundless resources and capital and teams at their disposal. So a lot of these decisions are made out of necessity, and are point in time decisions that may not feel as big as they are. I'll frame that knowing that these are small organizations that are doing the best they can to survive. Like, what's the rate for startups? It's like, 80, 90% of businesses fail within 5 years. So it truly is a survival calculation here. But I'll give a specific example here. I think it was Colorado had rolled out pay transparency regulation a handful of years ago. And I think I was on a recruiting team at the time, it was a fully remote team, and it might have been in and around COVID. And so the choice was not up to us whether we were going to hire remotely. That choice was already made because, just the nature of work at that time. And there was discussion about whether we would or would not hire from the state of Colorado entirely. It was a point of discussion in our recruiting process because we weren't quite sure the effects of this, because I don't think we built out that compensation architecture,
Hmm.
have salary bands built out. We didn't have levels built out within our teams. There wasn't that structure quite yet. And like, that was probably one of those early moments where I'd started thinking people structure is important early. And this is a really good example of why. So when I use compensation as an example here, people give a big goddamn what they're paid. I'm one of those people. I'm sure you do too. It is, at its essence, like I posted on LinkedIn recently about there's so much self-worth tied into the identities we hold as professionals.
Yes.
And it's because it enables so many other identities in our life. And so when we think about compensation and why the investment early in a founder's journey or a team's journey is important, it's because it's so much easier to solve for. What is it? It's so much easier to fix the roof when the sun's out. When your back's against the wall and you have to solve for things, your decision making tends to be less sound. You are making decisions probably out of fear rather than from a strategic standpoint. And that really is the argument, we make when investing in this structure early, because, in my, and I'll go back to your first question too, in my journey and having joined a lot of these organizations, especially as I became a more senior resource and sat on executive teams, I was often last to the table. Like, the investment in the people function was either as a result of some sort of chaos. And that could be there was a fundraise on the table. So it was exciting chaos, but we had to solve for things very quickly because the acceleration of growth depended on it. So it often meant we've got to hire a ton of people, or we have to hire a lot of people in different places, or there was some people calamity that had happened and that we had to solve for in order to move forward. And so, when I think about those things, it became more and more frustrating over time because it was, why are we not thinking about these things before we have to? It's like in your house, you don't worry about whether your electricity is up to code when your house is on fire. It's why there's preventative maintenance. And it's why you think about, like having ladders in your kids' rooms or fire blankets or fire extinguishers, because you want to catch those things before they become so disastrous that you can't help but solve for them. But again, it comes back to this idea of little problems are so much easier to solve and they just don't tend to go away. And so, my thought on this is very biased. And it's because I'm often hired in those organizations late in the game. And it becomes, okay, we've got a lot of growth. We've got people debt to account for. We've got, partnership across the
Hmm.
executive team that is fledgling at best. We've got a team full of people that feel like they don't have an outlet or someone to talk to. And so it becomes a little bit of professional therapy for an organization. And also, we want you to build the strategy and the team for this function with little to no dollars to do it. Like, it just boggled my mind that that was the plan. It was no
It's
plan.
such a tall order. It is such a tall order. And I love when you said it's easier to fix a roof when the sun's out. That visual, that's such a big deal because it means so much in business, and you're so spot on. And I've seen it. I've seen it in every organization I've worked, that person function, the people function, whatever you want to call it, it's labeled different ways. But to your point, it's the core, it's that human piece of how do you ensure that people feel vested?
Mhm.
Because, like you said, if folks feel like they're compensated fairly, that means a lot of things. It means security, financial security, things for you to do with your family, whether your goals are save, travel, pay off debt, whatever it is. You have that box checked, but you need to make sure that that social or business contract with the employee, you're going to pay them well and give them the benefits, but here are the other elements that is expected of them, and you have to abide by that contract. And it blows my mind to this day how quickly that type of social contract continues to be broken within a corporate setting with just a line item or a decision about we can even with our larger companies, our larger, and we are, Detroiters, Metro Detroiters. I love our auto companies. My mom was at GM for 30 years, but we also know that companies that are publicly held, they make shareholders happy vis-a-vis a shrinkage or a layoff, saving a lot of money, increasing those stock prices. But then what happens to the human capital of the mental state of those folks thinking they had security? This was, something for X many years. They would provide that loyalty to a company. It's really disheartening. So what I wanted to ask you about that, I want to ask you about the state of it's a big question, like, Abby, what do you think about the state of work? But as I have friends who are, either looking at shifting or leaving corporate positions because they don't feel like that loyalty is there, what would you say to folks who are concerned or wondering while they're cutting their steak or chicken dinner at home with their family, does my boss have my back? Does my company have my back? Am I just a number? It just seems a bit not as loyal on both ends as much today.
Yeah. It is a really hard place to find yourself, and I'll be vulnerable for a second because I've been in that position. I'm someone who's inclined toward
Yeah, same.
anxiety to the point of it is incapacitating to me and has been in my professional life. There were times where, when faced with a performance review, for no seemingly logical reason, was catastrophically, like, devastating to me. Like, the dread about having that conversation because of the immense responsibility I feel as a mom, as a partner, as a person who lacks a safety net in my life. My husband and I came from nothing. We don't have generational wealth at our disposal. Like, everything that we've done has been self-directed and out of a lot of necessity,
Mhm,
and drive and ambition to do it. And I can speak from a place of privilege now because I've done a lot of self-work on it, and I've seen therapists and I found coping strategies, and luckily I've been in a position where my talents have taken me to some rather high paying positions. So I can recognize that, I am speaking from a point of privilege here.
mhm,
When I'm talking to people about this and thinking through that journey, I absolutely empathize with the terror someone feels about, is the gig economy for me and how would I make that work? And it feels like I'm interviewing for brand new jobs all the time. And how would I cobble together enough to make this worth my time? Is my organization loyal to me? And what might I do? I mean, there's some basics there that, become, a factor in that equation. And some people are just never going to be inclined to, like, exploring that. They're just so risk averse that the stability of staying with an organization is the only option for a number of reasons, whether personal or, there might be some economic reasons for that or what have you, or capability. And, and I wish I had solid advice, on either side. It is a deeply personal decision to make. It has been, but here's what I will say. It has been insanely fulfilling to me as a professional to get to work in this way. And I think it has, like, forced a level of confidence I didn't know I was capable of. I just didn't. Like, I did not know that that was ever going to be an option for me and how I lived my life. It has given me a love of work that I've never had in 20 years.
mm,
It has given me the ability to speak very truthfully about values that guide my work and why it's important for me to uphold those things, why being a principled person is important to me, but also why feedback is important. It is a gift and I can take it as such in this capacity because my business, my livelihood relies on it. but I don't feel that need for such reassurance and extrinsic validation anymore because I've already taken the bet on myself. And now I have to. I have to keep going. I have to do these things. I am my own boss. I still feel that responsibility, but being able to work in terms that feel so authentic to me is absolutely incredible. So there is, I guess what I would say is if someone is at that tipping point of thinking about that as an opportunity, like
Mhm.
doing consulting or founding a business, being able to lean into what is the absolute worst outcome here? I think, the planning phase is important in saying like, are we financially able to do this and approach this? So this is not to discount the plan, but what is the absolute worst outcome that could happen? Let's say I make less money, but will my benefit in terms of my emotional well-being, my output, my value, the things I can do, the way I do those things, like what's the stack ranking of how those things relate to how you might derive satisfaction in the work that you do? I mean, the conversations I have tend to be around that rather than saying this or this is a great option. It is so very different based on each human being. This is just speaking from my personal experience, but um, it is hard work. It is hard work, but it is fulfilling work, and it has been the most fun I've ever had in 20 years of working.
I think that is a great response and also great insight for someone who's looking and they're on that teeter-totter of what they do in terms of staying, but also, you mentioned a keyword, planning to make sure that they plan for the next step, and I know that we're at time. And before I let you go, first, thank you. Like, because the feedback, the advice in terms of how a startup or a mid-sized company can work with you and why, I think is so key. The fact that you have that experience and also providing some of that insight for someone looking to go one way or the other. What is the best way for people to find you, to reach out, and to get a hold of the amazing team at SproutWise to continue the conversation and potentially work in terms of partnering up?
I tend to find, I've been kicking around LinkedIn a lot lately, so I tend to find LinkedIn is a really easy way to get a hold of me. I don't know that there are too many Abby Gates in Detroit, Michigan, but so that's a good one. Abby@sproutwise.com is an email to reach out to me and also explore the work that our team does or even explore advice. There's nothing I enjoy more than conversations like this where it is bringing some depth to this sort of calculation, whether it's for a business or the work you do, the way we would work together. There's just about nothing more fulfilling to me on a human level in doing this. So, email is a good way to go about that. LinkedIn, easiest and fastest way to get a response out of me, interestingly.
Awesome. Well, Abby, thank you for squeezing me in. Because when I
You
met
got
you,
it.
I have to talk to her in more detail because this is such an important topic, I think, especially
Thank you.
with today and the economy and how things are shifting. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
I'll see you all on the flip side with more conversations. Bye, Abby.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.